what came to my mind was you had mentioned before when we were talking about it how you didn't get along with your stepdad.
Yeah.
When you were young.
Yeah.
And so you went and lived with your grandparents.
Yeah.
Maybe talking about why you didn't get along with them. You just went by it probably because it's a personal thing. Do you know what I mean?
Well, that relationship, I don't mind talking about that. I don't really know why or how I got in his bad graces. Not that it was that bad, but Frankie got along, my younger brother, he got along pretty well with him. But I always kind of looked down my nose at me. But later on in life, I began to understand why. And that is that I bore a pretty close resemblance of my father, my real father, who had passed away. And people that noticed that in his presence would say, "Victor, you look so much like your father," and so forth. I think that kind of irked him. And so it wasn't my actions necessarily, it was just how I happened to look.
Right.
That might have had something to do with it. But then there was also the fact that after Charlotte was born, well, we had some disagreements before that, and but after Charlotte was born, it intensified due to the fact that we had a small two-bedroom house, and now we have a mother and a father and 2 boys and a little baby.
Right.
And it's getting a little crowded. And our relationship, he and I, it was tough on Mom. I mean, she was caught in the middle, as is often the case. And so consequently, it was to everyone's advantage if I could go up and live with Grandma and Grandpa Franzen. And I liked the idea because I had a lot of friends up there, and previously in my life I'd lived there, as you've already know, for periods of time, and so I liked that. And we weren't so far apart that I couldn't walk from one place to the other. I think it was a matter of a couple miles. So oftentimes when I was down on 4th Street, I would walk the 2 miles up to Grandma and Gramps for a day or so and walk back home again. And so this would be just reverse the process. Go from up there down, if I wanted to go down, play with my friends down there. So that eased the strain. But I still remember one instance where, and it was the first one that I can recall, that actually he said something kindly to me. That was on my 17th birthday. He shook my hand. Now this was strange for him to do to me. He shook my hand and says, "Congratulations, you're getting to be a man." And that was, I took that. I just kind of glowed as a reaction to him loosening up and being friendly. And so I say, that sticks with me. I can remember it was right out in Grandma's backyard. I can remember the piece of sod that we were standing on when it happened. That's the reason it impressed me so hard, so much. But I feel kindly for him in retrospect. He wasn't a very good provider. He was a piano tuner, and there wasn't a lot of that to be done. And I think most of our livelihood was what it was because of a $50 a month check my mother got from the federal government because of my father having died while in the service. He took out an insurance policy that was available to all the servicemen and that died that would give something to the family. Well, he was one that passed away, and so Mom got that $50 check a month, and it doesn't seem much now, and it wasn't too much then to run a whole family on.
Right.
But I think a good part of our livelihood came from that $50. But I was sad when he passed away. He was a strange man. He'd never go to a doctor. One of the reasons he couldn't afford it, he said, and he couldn't. But the other was that, well, the thing I'm getting to, he really had some trouble in his insides. He didn't know what it was, and he would get so sick. Sometimes you just grunt and groan, you know. And I don't know whether he took such things as aspirin or what, but and it would come and go. He'd be sick for a while, and then he wouldn't. Then another thing, he had this Model T Ford that he drove, and you had to crank those to start them. That is his vintage, he did. And one time he was out in Bluegrass, which is a small town out west of Davenport, tuning a piano, and after he got out done tuning the piano, he came out and started his Ford to come back home again. And the old Ford had a radiator cap on the top of the radiator.
Right.
And he's cranking his Ford car, and it kicked and pulled him back down, right down on that radiator cap, and took out all his teeth in front here. And he came all the way home bleeding like a stuck deer. And somehow they got that stopped, and he never went to a dentist, never did anything. He stayed that way. I don't know whether he had any dentures put in. He certainly must have, because he must have looked awful without any teeth there. And I don't remember that he looked that awful. So they made a denture to it. I was busy in the band during those days, and some of the events that transpired slipped by me. But he finally, that stomach problem killed him. He went to the hospital, and he wouldn't have gone then either, but Aunt Charlotte, Uncle Ed's wife, was a nurse earlier, and she implored him to go. She says, "You're going to go or you're going to die." So he finally went to the hospital, and by gosh, he did. And within 24 hours, he passed away. He had what was, I remember, as a strangulated hernia.
Oh.
I don't know just exactly what that means, but it sounds like something in his bowel area was all twisted up or something. I don't know.
They probably had a hernia the whole time.
Yeah, that's right. Good.
Because that's what would double you over in pain all the time.
Yeah. So that's that chapter.
Well, when we talked about how it was with your childhood and how you ran around with your friends and you played baseball and you played war and
yeah,
that was, I mean, you could have been describing my childhood.
True.
You know what I mean?
But you having lived in a small town like that, came closer to my type of childhood than had you lived in a larger town like this. Because you can see right now how restricted these kids are as far as play areas. We used to play baseball right out in the street.
Yeah.
What street can you think of around here that you could play baseball in?
Right.
Too much traffic.
Right.
And there's so much that has changed, and I think they're really restricted, and of course this is probably the way kids want it because they don't know anything else. But those of us that come from way back there, when we had the freedom to do so much more, we didn't have the material things they have now. And of course we didn't know there was such a thing possible because it hadn't been invented perhaps.
Right.
So we were very happy with what we had. We were very happy with the restrictions, without the restrictions, and we were very happy to go our own way at our own speed without the interference of adults telling us what to do and doing all our thinking for us, as is the case these days. And I grew up thinking it was a shame to waste a Saturday afternoon going to a movie. Now, kids loved movies.
Right.
But I mean, those of us, kids of those days, would rather go out and play ball on a Saturday afternoon than go to a movie. And so we'd usually go to a movie at night if we could, if we were old enough to go by ourselves, you know.
Right.
So anyhow, as I've said many times before in this spiel, I loved my childhood. It was great. But anyhow, when you say it was similar with you as with me, I think you're right. But I think the biggest reason it is because you came from a small town.
Yeah.
I think right today there is a vast difference in the raising of a child in a small town such as you came from, Sholo, and a town such as Phoenix. I don't know, but I can see, knowing you from a child, from a baby, and growing up there in Show Low, I can see, yes, that there's a tremendous difference, or a similarity between you and me that I wouldn't expect and probably wouldn't find in someone had you been born and raised here.
Right.
I think your attitude on a lot of things would have been different.
Yeah. We were going to talk a little bit about Prohibition. And I would like to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
Because
all right.
because that's the 20s and into the early 30s was when it was going on.
That's right. 1919 to 1933.
And this is the time that we're
Yeah.
coming to right now.
All right.
So I know I've heard stories through the family that there was family people that may have been a little bit involved in
Bootlegging?
in the process of manufacturing alcohol or
Well,
alcoholic beverages.
A lot of people, there was no law against making your own homebrew. You couldn't sell it.
Oh.
You could buy the makings to make your own homebrew, and my granddad, Grandpa Franz, had made it. He made his own wine, and perfectly legal. You'd go to the store and buy the malt and the hops and everything else, make your own beer. And it is powerful, too. And another thing I remember, at the bottom of every bottle was the sediment was yeast at the bottom. And of course, the stuff you buy that's siphoned off. You don't see that. But homebrew always had that little coating of yeast down at the bottom. You drank down to that, and then you didn't drink anymore. But well, 1919 they passed the Volstead Act, which meant liquor was verboten. They ruled against it, and it became a article of the Constitution, an amendment to the Constitution, 18th Amendment it was called. And so theoretically it was that should shut off all alcoholic beverages for the sale of alcoholic beverages throughout the country. But those fathers of democracy that made the rule didn't really know what they were doing, because alcohol has been a very favored beverage of the human species since the year one. And so a little silly law is not going to change it. They're still going to drink, and they did. Only now it became illegal, and it was called bootlegging. And what happened is that instead of regular bona fide breweries and distilleries making bona fide liquor, hard liquor and beer and things like that, this was all done by illegal breweries and hidden and out in the boondocks and places where they couldn't be discovered. And the irony of it was, where before liquor was taxed and the government got a little benefit off the sale of these things, now there was no tax or anything else, and it was costing us bundles to keep the bootleggers from flourishing. But the bundles didn't help, because the bootleggers did flourish, and with the good auspices of most of the humanity too, because everybody liked the idea, not that they drink in quantities, but the idea that they could have a drink if they wanted one. It was the lack of freedom that people resented, as much as the fact that there wasn't as much available. But if you knew how to get to a bootlegger, and everybody did, you could buy it. And another thing bad about the illegal hooch was there was no control on the quality of the stuff. Some of that stuff was what we called rot gut. And actually it did. It was so bad, it would rot your gut. Or in some cases it would blind you.
Wow.
It was a serious situation. And but the government lost all control over it, and they were fighting it. And you've heard of Elliot Ness, haven't you?
Oh yeah.
Elliot Ness, he was on TV. His exploits were on TV for a great many years. And he was an honest to goodness federal narcotics men. They're not narcotics, but alcoholic man, G-man. And his exploits were famous, and that's the reason they did this series on TV about him. But he was just one of thousands of G-men whose sole purpose in life was to find and break kegs of beer and close up illegal breweries and distilleries, and where they'd tear one up, two more would flourish. And another thing too, not only were they dying in here, but we were a great market for Cuba and other places. They would bring the illicit booze to the America by boat, you know, and then distribute it. And it was a holy loving mess, I'll tell you that. And anyhow, that went on until 1933 in the Roosevelt administration, when they finally found out that it was a losing battle, and they what do they do when they kill an amendment?
Well, they passed another one to repeal it, I think.
Yeah, well,
isn't that what it was?
well, whatever they did, they knocked the 18th Amendment of Volstead out of our Constitution. And everybody not everybody, a lot of those that were the dries, that they called those that wanted to keep prohibition, predicted that, boy, everybody would be drunk the minute they could out. But boy, the opposite took place. It seems that when it became legal again, people didn't want it as much. There was a certain thrill in knowing it was illegal and going to speakeasies, which were bars that were hidden away and allegedly out of the law's knowledge, but nothing was out of the law's knowledge. But the law just let them get by because they were paying off or something. It made crooks out of everyone. It made drunks out of a lot of people who wouldn't have been drunks too. But anyhow, the repeal, this is the word I'm getting, the repeal of the Volstead Act was a real blessing, and for a lot of people and for society in general.
Well, putting it on a personal level, how did it affect you and your family?
All right,
and
I'll
things
tell
like
you.
that?
Well, I don't know it affected the family too much. We were not a family of drinkers. We drank socially. My granddad, who brewed his own home brew, as I mentioned, probably had a bottle of beer a day, something like that, after he got home from work or something like that, or maybe two, and would share it with members of the family that were over there and everything else, and also the same way with his wine. Grandma Franzen never touched either one of it. Oh, that brings another aside, and that is, we would like to taste the beer, you know, as kids, and so we'd ask Grandpa whether we could have a taste. Well, Grandpa would give us a taste. he didn't say anything wrong, but Grandma did. So Grandma would make us root beer. And I remember Grandma's root beer as being the tastiest stuff that was ever. But she made that purely to keep us from having beer. She said, anytime you want beer, I'll give you root beer, you know. It was one of those things. And which we didn't mind. Beer would satisfy our curiosity, but the root beer would satisfy our taste.
Yeah.
It tasted much better than beer. And so that was a happy compromise. And then in high school, because it was illegal, and there was a certain thrill in trying to beat the odds, we would buy alcohol from bootleggers. And I remember one place in particular, Grandinetti's store. The Grandinetti, Mr. and Mrs. Grandinetti, which are elderly people from Italy, they had a store out in East Davenport, small store. But their main stock and trade was bootleg hooch. And we kids, 14, 15 years old, could go in there, and if we had the right amount of money, and ask, you go to the back and just stand around and wait till she waited on you, she or he, whatever. and you get a half pint of hooch or something, and give them the money for it and walk out. And that's a great thing for prohibition, to allow a situation like that to go on. And so anyhow, we thought that was great, and we'd go out Friday night, probably partying or something like that, and have this little bottle of stuff. And I think in a few times I've got drunk, and I think it's only been a few times, probably 3 or 4 times in my life that I got really plastered.
Yeah. All when you were a teenager, or
well,
or you're just saying?
I mean, my entire life. I'll say it's half a dozen times my entire life. But anyhow, we always wanted to impress everybody, all of our buddies, that boy, we're really loaded. So we would put on a drunk act, you know, and slur our speech and do all the stuff that indicated we were drunk, and we weren't. You know, as soon as our parents came, we're sober as a judge. Oh shoot! But
so was that when you were? This was like younger teenage years,
well, I'd
when
say
you do
from
stuff like that.
15, from 15 on. Oh, and another thing, it was popular to have a bottle of hooch in your high school locker.
Oh.
Yeah, that you were one of the ends. it was ridiculous. And there was such a thing as spiking. You could buy near beer. Near beer is what the word implies. It was nearly beer, and the reason it wasn't all beer is because the alcoholic contents was missing. So you had the taste and everything else, but no alcohol. But you could buy that, and then you would spike it. By spiking, you'd drink a little of the top off the bottle, enough to accommodate some real alcohol. And you'd put it in, and you'd turn it over and mix it. See how good I am at this?
You've done it a couple times.
Then you turn it back up, and then you drink it, see, because that mixes it all up. And but like I say, I mean, I was a moderate for a kid. And in fact, I think we were all moderate drinkers. Like I say, we pretended we were drunk, much more than we ever were. And we never, as my gang, ever got in an automobile accident because of having drunk too much. So that says something for the fact that we weren't drinking an awful lot. And furthermore, it was often that you just got sick if you drank too much, and you threw up.
Right.
All over wherever. So that was discouraging, and that's one of the reasons I've kept from drinking too much, I suppose, not because I was so moral, but because if I drank too much I got sick, and I didn't like that. But anyhow.
So that was it. So it sounds like it was fairly common for people to brew their own.
Oh yeah, it was. Yeah. And those families that liked to have a drink would brew their own, and it was perfectly legal. But you couldn't sell it.
Right.
You couldn't distribute it or anything like that. There's laws against that. But for home consumption, there's nothing wrong with it. But a lot of people just didn't brew it at home. It was so easy to find a bootlegger, find a place to buy it. I mean,
it wasn't worth the trouble
to
make your own.
Within every square 3-block area, there was someplace you could buy it.
And it was easier than having to make your own.
Yeah.
Well, since we're on the subject of illicit things.
Well, you love illicit things, don't you?
Why not?
All right.
What about drugs? I mean, I know the forms of drugs have evolved to an extent now where there's lots of different kinds. I mean, back then there was opium and there was marijuana and things like that. And I know they weren't, obviously not as widespread as now, but certainly they were around. Did that? And I know in the 20s, especially, marijuana became pretty well known, if not widely used.
Not very well known. I don't remember, and being a kid, I would be hip to all this because mostly teenagers are on top of anything that's illegal. They seem to gravitate toward it. But I don't remember marijuana. The first time I remember marijuana was when I was in the band business. Or no, this was before I was in the band business. Or just starting out in the band business. And I went over to Rock Island, Illinois to hear a band that came in from out of town on a one-nighter to a ballroom over there. And I don't remember whether we saw him smoking on the stand or something, but anyhow, somebody told us that the band was high on marijuana. What's marijuana? You know, that was the first time I ever heard of it. And then they found out, well, they're smoking that stuff up there. You know, I don't know whether the ones that were informing me of this knew any more of what they were talking about or not. But anyhow, that was my introduction to marijuana. I never heard of it. But the heavier stuff, like particularly heroin. The earliest I remember of this was back in the 20s when they put out a movie. What was the name of it? I don't know whether I can remember. This is way back in Charlie Chaplin's time. This is back in the 20s and perhaps the early 20s. It was the early 20s. And it was a movie about a guy that became a dope fiend and the trials and tribulations he went through. I remember they likened dope as being a wolf.
Yeah.
And they had this wolf ghost come into the picture at the beginning of the scene and disappear or come back again in the back at the end of the scene. It was a symbolism.
Right.
But anyhow, this movie told of the disastrous consequences of this dope and everything else, and how he went out of his mind and everything else, and how he couldn't do anything but think of dope, which was actually a fact about it. If you get high on that stuff, you're hooked.
Right.
It's true today. And they're lucky to ever get out of it. But that was my introduction to that. As far as dope being used, generally, no. I don't know and never did know anybody that was on dope. Not to say that there was none, but it was very few and far between.
Right.
And in fact, it wasn't until the 60s that dope entered the scene, in my recollections. Honey, do you remember that?
What's that?
When was the first time you realized that that dope was a part of the scene?
In the 60s?
In the 60s, that's what I thought. Prior to that, the only things that we had going against us was alcohol and cigarettes. I think even in the 60s we knew that cigarettes weren't good for us. I think we found that out in the 50s. But as far as dope is concerned, nothing. And then in the 60s along come marijuana. To begin with, that's the first thing we heard of. Then we started hearing about cocaine. And then the resurgence of heroin,
Right.
which we've always thought was the worst of the worst. You know?
Right.
Cocaine's bad enough, but the heroin was the most addictive of all.
Right.
And I guess that's true yet today.
Well, getting back to that, then, what were the attitudes about smoking tobacco, cigarettes, and things like that? I mean, I know
Well,
in the golden era of Hollywood, everyone smoked.
absolutely.
At least they
certainly
showed
did.
everybody smoking.
Well, and that got all the rest of us smoking too. That was one of the things that had all of our movie stars were sucking on cigarettes. And about my 15th year or something like that, I experimented around along with other kids. We'd usually get some cigarette butts. Somebody had left a long cigarette or something somewhere, and we'd start sucking on those, and boy, we'd cough and hack and everything else. But because it was the in thing, we stayed at it and persisted until we got over the hacking. Our lungs became accustomed to it, and so and then we were hooked. And I wasn't hooked that early, but I experimented that early. I don't know when I'd find
So,
it.
clear back in the 20s, then it was an in thing.
Yeah.
Was that? But that was, I mean, that wasn't necessarily from Hollywood because
Well-
that was silent pictures and things like that. I mean, was that why it was in, or was it in because
Well, it
just
had an
was?
awful lot
because
to
the
do it.
adults did it, or
It's the same way today. I mean, in spite of what the Hollywood wants to tell you, what they put out in movies has a tremendous effect
right.
on our young people, if not the older ones as well. I mean, now, if you'll notice, everybody is smoking again in the movies, and boy, I'll tell you, that has an influence. And we find out that our kids are smoking more, and perhaps that's the reason for it, or one of the reasons. No, movies weren't the only thing. It was a peer pressure type of thing. All our kids were doing it, and so we had to do it. You know, peer pressure is a tremendous amount of pressure all through life, but mostly teenage. You got to do what the crowd is doing. But that's not to say it isn't true when you're older too, because you've heard of the thing keeping up with the Joneses. It's more a question of keeping up with everybody else,
Right.
not just the Joneses. And so that's peer pressure as exerted upon adults. Kids, we always hear of peer pressure where kids are concerned. I mean, their dress. I mean, one is if it's like saddle shoes. When your mother was a kid, saddle shoe was a white shoe with a black overlay across the center. They called it the saddle. And then saddle shoes with it, and boy, you wouldn't come to school without saddle shoes, you know. And that's the same way today with these type of things.
Right. Tennis shoes.
Yeah, you got to have not only tennis shoes, but you got to have the right brand
Right.
tennis shoes.
Right.
And the right brands cost you about $80. I buy mine for 15 because I don't care. So anyhow, we were talking about dope and
Well, smoking.
and smoking.
specifically.
So anyhow, well, and another thing too, as is discovered now, finally, the cigarette companies, the tobacco companies, kept the fact that it was a dangerous drug so secret that nobody ever had an idea that there was any way you're going to pay ultimately for smoking these things. And so why not? And they were so cheap. I mean, I think the first time I bought a pack of cigarettes, which is 20 cigarettes, it cost about 15 cents. Now it's approaching $5, $4 or $5, because of the horrendous taxes they're putting on it.
Didn't people have any kind of idea of what it might be? I mean, because if everyone just assumed it was okay or not that bad, I mean, I'm sure your mom wouldn't let you smoke.
No, your parents were very disappointed to know that you've been smoking and so forth. They rallied against it, but I don't know exactly why, except that it was an adult habit, and where kids weren't supposed to do it. Maybe there was some feeling that it wasn't good for you. Well, they certainly knew it wasn't good for you, but
Yeah,
they didn't
know how
necessarily
bad
know how bad it was. But in spite of what parents thought, smoking was taken up by the majority of the people somewhere between 15 and 18 years of age. It's the kids that started. Anyone that was an adult that wasn't hooked didn't usually get started on it. They hook the kids, and once you're hooked on that stuff, it's awful hard to quit. It's a dope. And fortunately for me, I finally quit. But I smoked most of my life.
When did you start?
Well, I can't say for sure. I'd say 17, 18, somewhere in there. Let's see, when I was in the band.
So it was when you got into the band?
Sometime about the time I got in the band.
In the Emo Flint band?
Well, even probably a little bit ahead of that. Because peer pressure, you know, high school and everything else. I was not immune.
Right.
And I quit. After I'd been in the band for quite a while. In fact, it was after 1934 when we went to Chicago. No, before we went to Chicago, 1933 or somewhere in there. We all smoked in the band. And that wasn't unusual. Everybody smoked.
Right.
It's unbelievable, particularly men. The women didn't start smoking that early. It was bad for women to smoke. But pretty soon it became chic for them to smoke, and they started smoking. And they soon caught up with men. But somewhere along prior to going to Chicago, Roy Lear, our trumpet player, quit smoking, and which is quite a feat. And anyhow, he made such a big noise about it and was ridiculing the rest of us because we smoked, you know, and that I thought, I'm going to fix him. So I quit.
Oh.
To shut him up. and so I guess I was married at that time, so it had to be sometime either late 34s or somewhere. What difference does it make? I was young. And so I stayed off, as near as I can tell, probably 3 months, which is enough to get over the habit completely. But not completely, because they always a little dry. But I mean, you have, by that time, you have enough resistance against it that you've won the game.
Right.
And but anyhow, in spite of that, I started smoking again. And my next effort to quit smoking was 1955 or 1956, 57, somewhere in there. Well, I had my studio over in Hollywood, California. And I remember, for some reason, I quit. For some reason, I don't remember. And that time it only lasted about 2 weeks. Now, 2 weeks, you're pretty well, you get it pretty well beat in 2 weeks. You're still hooked, but I mean, it isn't bothering you as much as it did the first few days, you know. And I could have easily walked away from it, but there again, I picked it up again. And then I kept on smoking. I changed to pipe. The last 25 years of my smoking, I smoked a pipe, which isn't nearly as hard on you as cigarettes. Cigarettes just suck in every breath of this stuff. But with pipe, it's what you get by accident, because you puff, but you don't inhale. But nevertheless, you've got a cloud of smoke around you, and you inhale that cloud of smoke, which is much less than getting it direct. And so consequently, it's probably only a tenth as bad as cigarettes. And I enjoyed it. It's another thing about pipe smoking. It's an enjoyable thing. A cigarette is simply a nervous habit.
Right.
You get in a habit of smoking a cigarette under certain circumstances, like when I was writing or something like that. I'd write and I'd come to a phrase a place where I wanted to stop and think about something, you know, before I wrote any further. Pick up a cigarette. Same thing when I wrote arrangements. I'd write and then all of a sudden I'd stop and I want to figure something. Pick up a cigarette. Many times I'd pick up a cigarette and have it lit before I realized I still had one on the ashtray burning. Yeah. It's just that kind of a habit.
Right.
Oh, I'll tell you a habit. Back in the 50s, when I was active in the mutuals up at the church, Mormon church, the family all went there. And I didn't go to church, but I was very active in mutual. Whenever the kids went putting on plays or something, I'd help them with it and so forth. So I was considered one of the clan, even if it wasn't. And so anyhow, I had done something illustrious, I guess. I don't remember what, but anyhow, because of that, I was allowed on a Sunday to sit up behind the podium in the back with all of the wheels, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And here I am, sitting up there and back, and out in front of me is the whole audience, you know, in the chapel, in full chapel. And I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden I get a little nervous. I pick out my pack of cigarettes, and I pop like that to pop one of the cigarettes out. And right then I realized where I was. And I snuck that thing back in my pocket like as fast as you could ever believe. And I was hoping, oh boy, I hope nobody saw that. And maybe they didn't, because nobody mentioned anything. That was a busy moment for me, I'll tell you. But that's how the habit gets you. You find yourself grabbing one of those things in places where you shouldn't. But anyhow, I finally quit smoking in 1983. All the way along, I kept telling myself, by this time now I know that smoking is harmful, and if I gotta go, I don't want to do it because of smoking, because I can quit smoking.
Right.
Some of the other things I might not be able to do anything about, but this I can. So I made a deal with myself. I says, if I ever get a bad report on my lungs from a physical, I had a physical regularly every year, that's going to be the end of my smoking. And I had myself conditioned for that fact, because it's over years I kept telling myself this. If you ever get a bad one, boy, you're going to quit smoking. Well, anyhow, along about 1956, or somewhere there about, what am I talking about? I'm talking about 83. I went to the doctor for my physical, and he taps my back and he listens and he says, I hear a little rattle or some little noise in there. So he listens some more, and he says, you smoke? And I says, yeah, I do. I smoke a pipe. He said, well, I think you better be a little cautious. It sounds like you may be getting a little emphysema. What's emphysema? And he tells me it's a deterioration of the lung. And I always have had what I call respiraphobia. I don't think I never found it in the dictionary, but it should be. It's a fear of not being able to breathe. And so that scared the wits out of me. I thought, boy, I wonder if I've gone too far with this. But bingo, the next day was the last day I ever. That evening, I went to dinner with Nancy, your aunt, and Gary, your cousin. And I smoked a pipe after that dinner, I remember, after having been to the doctor in the afternoon. And then I never touched it again after that. And it came fairly easier. I remember going back to the days when I tried to quit smoking cigarettes, and boy, it was a holy terror of a job, believe me. But it seemed to go easier, and I don't know whether because pipe smoking was an easier switch to non-smoking, or whether it was the fact that I had conditioned myself, that I had heard the magic words, and I had quit. But that was the end of the smoking. Thank goodness for that. Oh, and another thing, smoking a pipe, you burn your clothes, and you burn everything. You know, the ashes fall out of your pipe and all over everything. I didn't have a shirt to my name, and very few pair of pants that didn't have little tiny pinholes all over where I hit by live ash. And also furniture. Oh, it was a mess.
That's funny. Well, I want to. I think I want to call that good for today.
Okay.